Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated. We are about to begin a session titled The English Language Literatures of South Asia, Do They Interact with Each Other? The speakers for this session are Sadaf Saaz, H.M. Naqvi, Ritu Menon, and the moderator is Muneeza, Shamsie. A prominent Karachi-based literary personality, Muneeza Shamsie is the author of Hybrid Tapestries, The Development of a Pakistani English Literature from Colonial Times to the Present, guest editor of the Journal of Post-Colonial Writing, and managing editor of a work in progress, The Oxford Companion to the Literature of Pakistan. Her extensive work includes 3 anthologies, which she has edited, including the award-winning And the World Changed, Contemporary Stories by Pakistani Women. She's a regular contributor to Dawn and Newsline. Muneeza Shamsie.
Well, I hope I can work this time. Last time. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome this panel. I hope Hussein will be joining us shortly. We have with us Saaz Siddiqui, who is a poet from Bangladesh. She is the author of several collections, one that I know of, which is Sari Dreams. She's also a co-organizer of the Dhaka Literature Festival. And there's Ritu Menon, who's a distinguished Indian publisher. She, a feminist publisher. She was set up Kali for Women and then Women Unlimited. She has also published Me, which was a wonderful experience for me, I have to say, a collection of Pakistani stories. And of course, over here, she has just launched the biography which she has written of Nayantara Sehgal. H.M. Naqvi, I don't think really needs, he will be with us very soon, and he is, of course, the award-winning author of Homeboy. What we're going to discuss is whether, as you see, we've got one Bangladeshi, one Indian, and one Pakistani panelist, and we're going to discuss whether the literatures, what is called South Asian English literature, of our respective nations interact with each other. Of course, it has a very long history, South Asian English literature. It dates back to 1795, which was when the first book by an Indian was written in English. And that actually precedes the famous Fort William project, where they started writing, Urdu prose, and actually, Bagho Bahar by Mir Aman. So actually, Sheikh Deen Muhammad's English book precedes that. But then there's a kind of long history, which I won't go into, but the center of Indian English writing for a very long time was Bengal, because that was the capital, that was the British capital. That's where they would set up the first colleges, and then you had all these writers such as Henry de Rosio, the Dutts, and later on you have families such as the Suravardi family, which was writing in English. Well, Hussein, we've already introduced you, and so I'm glad he's here.
Excellent.
I'm only just starting. Oh, that's okay. We're starting with a preamble. So one of the earliest among the Muslim families was the Suravardi family. And what you get by 1937 is a work of Shahid Suravardi started writing poetry much earlier, but in 1937 he published a book of verse which is widely regarded as the first sort of modern book of poetry by an Indian English poet, because it had clear influences of Auden and Pound, and he was not writing that kind of Orientalist poetry. So in a way, he is a poet because he belonged to Bengal, he belonged to Midnapur, which is now, I think, in East Pakistan or Bangladesh, and he was so he belongs to India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. He is a very integral part of our heritage. Then you get the the new sort of writing that began, they really claim it that Indian English writing or South Asian English writing begins with 1930s with Mulk Rajnanand, R.K. Narayan, Raja Rao, Ahmed Ali. These were considered the four sort of great writers. But as they were saying earlier, they did romanticize this Indian world in which they inhabited. They were sort of speaking to the British colonizer. I'd like to diversify a little bit. Actually, the two books that blew me away were, one was a story in 1905 written by a lady in Dhaka, or maybe she was in Calcutta, Ruqayya Sakhawat Hussain. She wrote Sultana's Dream, in which she reversed, and this is quite different, I think, to anything that was written at the time. She reversed roles, and of a woman who comes to a land called Ladyland, and it's a work of science fiction also, where she actually foresees things like laser power and the nuclear bomb. I mean, it's a tremendous feminist work, and it just blew me away. And then the other book that I found quite extraordinary was written in about, I think, in the 1940s, of a writer of whom I knew nothing, Iqbalun Nisa Hussain. And today I find, perhaps in a parallel session, there's a book being launched about her. And she wrote in English a book called Parda and Polygamy in a Muslim Household. Well, what happens now is that all this work is beginning in Indian English writing. And then, of course, we have partition. And, you know, India and Pakistan, sort of with all the bitterness and all the politics and so on, the writing between these two communities, the literary community, is divided. And there's not much communication. There's customs, there's all sorts of problems. So Pakistani poets, I can say with some certainty, had very little awareness of what was going on in India at the time, in the 1950s and perhaps the 1960s. Some work in the diaspora may have trickled through, but very little. The big thing that was happening here in the 1960s, late 1960s, was the birth of a Pakistani English poetry, of contemporary poetry, which was really of a very high standard, and that really developed before Pakistani fiction of a high standard. But what happens is, just as this is taking place, and there's this discourse which took place between East and West Pakistan on idiom, on writing a kind of new poetry. The 1971 war took place, and Pakistan and Bangladesh then become two separate countries. So and of course, the literature has continued to grow, and what is known as South Asian English, but it's from each country, although it's often discussed as a collective. And I want to ask the panel for each one of them to answer in turn, do the literatures of South Asia from the different countries interact with each other? We'll begin with Hussain.
I want to tell you a story. A few years ago, I was invited to speak at the Sharjah Literary Festival. I didn't realize Sharjah had a literary festival until I was invited there, and I showed up, showered, changed, headed to the expo center. The audience is saying this is not loud enough. Can you turn it up? Okay. Expo Center, it was animate. Thousands of people were there to attend cooking sessions and buy self-help books. The literary component of the festival was very small. The sessions were sparsely attended. As I walked in, however, the organizer of the festival said, "Oh, H.M. Naqvi, you're here. So wonderful to see you. You know, we've just had a request from a Malayali writer for you to introduce him." And I said, you know, I don't know much about Malayali literature. And I don't know why I would be asked to introduce somebody like me, would be introducing somebody like him. He said, oh, I said, so I'd rather not. And just when I said that, she turned and said, oh, here he is. He was a venerable old gentleman, white hair, and I felt silly for if somebody has requested me to introduce him. I felt that I was compelled. And he said, Naqvi, so good that you have agreed to introduce me. And I said, sir. And I didn't know his name. And I was taken to a hall much like this. Most of the sessions were very sparsely populated, but here there were 300 people in the audience, children hanging off the rafters, and a little girl approached me with a bouquet, and I sat down in the front, and then they began talking in Malayali. And Malayali has a very sweet cadence, but I don't know, I'm not conversant in it. And so for 5, 10, 15 minutes, they kept going on, and then there was a silence, a pregnant silence, a silence that suggested that I had to do something. So I placed the bouquet on the adjacent chair and took the stage. And there were 300 people, 600 eyeballs looking at me, and I didn't know what the hell to say. So I said, okay, well, you start with the facts. And I said, I am H.M. Naqvi. I hail from Karachi, which is in Pakistan. And I was done with the facts. So I said, okay, now you have to continue. I said, we might be separated by borders. We might be separated by language. But we share a common cultural ecosystem, we share a common literary imagination. I made this very bold statement. And then I said, now what do I do? I said, well, you have to back it up, present some evidence. So I said, for instance, I have been weaned on the works of, and I'm thinking it can't be a North Indian writer, it has to be someone from South India. And I said, Narayan. And there was sort of polite nods in the audience. They said, yeah, he's not South enough for us, and he wrote in English. And I said, okay, H.M. Naqvi, you're sort of better well-read than that. So I scratched my head, and I said, but, the story that stirred something within me as a child, it was class 5, was O.V. Vajayan's After the Hanging. Nobody here might be familiar with O.V. Vajayan, but he was the great Malayali modernist writer. And there was resounding applause. I sort of accidentally hit the nail on the head. But now I'd just spoken 4 sentences, and I still didn't know the name of the author I'm supposed to introduce. So I turned and I saw his book lying there in front of him. And it had a very complicated South Indian polysyllabic title, but his name was very short. Or there was some writing that wasn't as long, and it said Setu. And I said, Setu? And he said, yes. I said, sir. I said, will you give me the honor of reading from your new novel? And he said, of course. And one of the few things I can do well, I don't do much well, is read. So I read the first page, and it was a lovely, it was a translation. It was obvious it's a translation, but it was a lovely translation. And I was, and I was moved and surprised. And after I read for 3 or 4 minutes, I said, I turned to him and I said, "Sir, if I can manage the atmosphere you've managed to conjure on that first page in my work, I'll consider myself a successful writer." And he turned to me and he said, "H.M. Naqvi, I didn't know there was so much atmosphere in this page until you read it." And so soon I slipped from the stage and I did what I had to do. I was asked by a Malayali author, because I'm known in, my work is in English, and this was his first translation. He's written 40 books. And so this sort of anecdote, in my mind, represents how, despite borders and language, and we are sort of denizens of a common cultural system. I mean, our connections are mostly with North India, but even in the South, the South has informed my sensibility.
Thank you. That's really very interesting. Ritu, how do you see it? Do you feel there's an interaction? And do you see it in fiction? And we're basically concentrating on fiction and poetry, I think, because I thought it would get too diverse.
Well, I was very interested to see how Hussein's story would proceed, because I kept thinking, this happens in India all the time. We have 32 languages. We don't interact with each other. So, and of course we can't interact with each other unless we are able to get that work in translation. So, of course now we are speaking of 3 different countries and perhaps 3 different contexts, although same cultural, historical and so on similarity. But the point I wanted to make is this, and I think that you raised a very important issue when you began, which is the ruptures that are created in the literary domain, as well in the art, theatre and performing arts domain. So let's say in the cultural domain, the ruptures that are created by very significant historical divisions. Okay. And why I think that's very important is because between India, Pakistan and Bangladesh, and I'm speaking now as a publisher, there is no trade. We cannot trade in printed material between India and Pakistan. It's not allowed. If books have to come from India into Pakistan, they have to go either via Singapore or via Dubai. The same holds true from material from Pakistan into India. No newspapers are allowed, no printed material, no other exchange is possible except through piracy and smuggling. Between India and Sri Lanka, for example, it is zero. There is absolutely no way by which a regular exchange of material can take place between, I would say this as a sort of 30-year experience of trying to get books across borders. It doesn't happen. Between India and Bangladesh, there are problems of credit, currency, and payment. These are very real problems. These are very real issues. There is no distribution to speak of across the countries. So how do we read what each other is writing? We read it, as always, via the West. Something gets published in the UK. This was true, by the way, even of the period you spoke of. I mean, everything was published by John Murray or Victor Gollancz or Hamish Hamilton or what have you. We read each other in our context, in our countries, when something is published outside the region and comes back to each individual country. That doesn't mean we speak to each other. We don't. That's the case with books or with other printed, but I'm not going to talk about other printed material. There is a huge paraphernalia around books which encourages conversation, which we simply don't have. Book reviews, critics, seminars, educational courses, and so on. After all, where do books find a home? Not just in our individual homes, but in the academic environment, in institutional spaces, in literary establishments. It doesn't happen. So the entire culture surrounding books is one of, let's say, separation. So I see now some possibility of this interaction happening via the internet, and perhaps in spaces that are not controlled by physical borders, but it is very much in its early stages. And of course, festivals like this help, but these are so few and far between the countries that I think they can only be a beginning. They can't actually make for the kind of free exchange that we need.
Sadaf, how do you find this interaction, or has there been a disruption?
I think a few very important points have been raised. That we do have this commonality of subcontinental sensibility. In East Pakistan, I think this rupture, interruption, whatever, I think we were affected in all sorts of different ways. You were talking initially in the preamble about initially much of the writing in Indian English was kind of imitating the sort of romantic English. And then at a time when the Indian subcontinent was trying to explore Indian English, taking Indian English, the sensibility and the content from India or the subcontinent, and yet using English language. When this experimentation started happening, soon afterwards partition happened. And it was not just a partition, I think, of politics, but it was just a partitioning of the mind in that sense. Because India, having adopted English as one of the languages of India, even though there was an opposition, I think, even within India, to not use English, I think Buddhadev Bose also sort of says it's an inconceivable loss of mother tongue using English. But there was a group of experimental and movements in India then, the Writers' Workshop and Ezekiel doing Quest Journal, where a lot of experimentation could take place. Whereas in East Pakistan, soon after partition, we had 1952, where we were fighting for our language, Bangla. And so not only was East Pakistan on the periphery to the whole experimentation that was happening, then English became periphery within the then East Pakistan, subsequent Bangladesh. And in the sort of decades after partition, what Ritu was saying about accessibility was a huge issue. And a lot of the conduit for discovering the experimentation that was going on in India, there was a lot of thirst, hunger, whatever it was, to find out other writing in English that was going on. That was through perhaps the umbrella of the Commonwealth, but not sort of directly. And yet, as H.M. was saying, we have this common sensibility and this common unity, which would have given us strength as a community. And subsequently, when different anthologies have come out of India and Pakistan, that has been very inspirational. And then more recently, the internet has then given a lot more sort of impetus to writing that's happening in Bangladesh now. But I think we're far behind, and one of the casualties, I think, of this whole process has been that we could have had far more people writing in English. And that doesn't mean that our rich Bengali literature heritage would have been, at threat at all. It just means that a lot of people who were comfortable in English could have used English, Indian English as their own, have been denied that, I think.
I actually wondered, as a writer, I mean, Hussein, I know you read a lot of, you've often mentioned Gauss and you've read Zamindar. You must have read other South Asian writers. Were you actually consciously influenced by any of them? Or was there an interaction between you or any of the writers that influenced you? And I know that you have the Western sensibility also, so it's quite a complicated question. But
I as my anecdote suggests, was weaned on Narayan. I think all Pakistani writers have read Indian writers. I think, and now Indians are reading Pakistani writers. Pakistani writers are very popular in India. So even though even if the carton of books has to make a circuitous journey, it gets here. And so if you go to Itwar Bazaar today, the book that sells the most, that's been selling the most for the last 15, 20 years is Arundhati Roy's God of Small Things. And it's, to its credit, or to its popularity, it's also sold as in pirated form. So Indian writers have remained popular here, and vice versa. I don't think that the infrastructure infrastructural problems that you had was suggesting causes such great divide, but there is more than the mere infrastructure, and the books do get here. They take longer, perhaps. Adiga's White Tiger was very popular here. And secondly, do North Koreans and South Korean, is there sort of a commonality in literature amongst them, or Iran and Iraq? I mean, there are ecosystems and there are borders everywhere in the world, but good literature transcends borders. Marquez is also sold in Itwar Bazaar by the kilo for the last so many years. So there are different facets to this issue, and one cannot reduce it merely to these exogenous historic events. We're not peculiar or to suffer great exogenous events. This is sort of the way that Germany and France were at daggers drawn about Alsace-Lorraine, and there must have been infrastructural problems there. But Sartre and Camus were popular in Germany and influenced German writing.
How has do you have a response to that? How has it influenced you? What are the changes you've seen as a publisher?
No,
for example?
I think that there are two different issues here. And perhaps we can talk about that a little bit as a conversation even among ourselves. Of course, Arundhati Roy is available in Pakistan, but it's not the Indian edition which is available, it's the Random House edition which is available, which is the point I was making earlier. And same is the case with Arvind Adiga. But you had to go to Sharjah to find Setu, because no one in the UK or the US would have published Setu. The point I'm making is this, that there is a sort of a kind of passage that has become the common passage for all of writing from India, Pakistan and Bangladesh, and that passage necessarily goes around the Western Hemisphere. So, of course, we know, I know of your book, and I know of Sadaf's book, and it's my business to know about everything else that is being written by Pakistani and Bangladeshi writers. That's my job. It is not the job of the person on the street to keep abreast of what is happening in our countries, in each other's countries. How do we know about it? We can't know about it just by saying that one or two writers, Vikram Seth, Kamila Shamsie, Babsi Sidhwa, Muhammad Hanif, Tehmima, all these writers published abroad, every single one of them, first. I want to make a point about Arundhati because you took her name. She has been the only writer from the subcontinent in recent times, by which I mean the last 20 years or 15 years, whose agent was forced by her to release the book in India before it was released anywhere else in the world, even though she had been signed up in the UK and been bought by the US. She is the only writer who insisted that her work be published first in India by herself. She did not publish with anybody else. She published her own book herself. It's not that book that you will find in Iqbal Market. You will find the Random House edition, you will find the Granta edition, you will find every other edition, but not that one. Similarly, you will not find our edition of Muneeza's book of Pakistani women writers in Pakistan. You will find the locally co-published edition, which is the way I think we ought to go. I don't think we ought to depend on whether Bloomsbury or HarperCollins or Penguin decide that they want to send their books to our part of the world. I think we ought to be doing this among ourselves. To this day, I cannot sell Muneeza's book edited by her that we published in Pakistan, and I certainly cannot sell it in Bangladesh. These are very real issues. So, of course, as writers, as readers, we will try and find what we can, wherever we can in the world, but that does not change the situation on the ground. And that's what interests me as somebody who, for the last 30 years, has been trying to make available our literatures to ourselves. I don't want to have to go to Sharjah to find Setu. I don't want to have to go to Toronto to find Michael Ondaatje. I don't want to have to go to the Caribbean to find somebody else. One of us. Michael Ondaatje is a Sri Lankan. He's not Canadian. Why do I have to do that?
If I may interject, I can name maybe 10 Pakistani writers that are only published in India, and the books that are published in Pakistan are the ones that are published in India.
Yes, that's fine. I mean, I think that it is possible, and they should be co-published here is the point I'm making.
That's fine.
I don't think Pakistani writers, if they can't be published in the UK or the US, should then say, acha chalo, India mein ho jate hain publish. I don't think that's a very healthy situation. I think we should be co-publishing. I really think it is very possible to have a simultaneous edition in Pakistan and India and Bangladesh. Why not? You're absolutely right. But let me tell you, no Indian writer will say, acha chalo, I'm not published in the UK or the US, let me get published in Pakistan. Or let me get published in Bangladesh. We are talking only about English.
But in Urdu, that's possible.
In Urdu, it's absolutely possible.
No, in Urdu, in other languages, there is an interaction.
Course,
In English,
other
there
languages,
seems to be all kind of barriers.
But
Hence
we're talking
this
only
panel.
about English here.
Yeah. Hence this panel, yes.
Of course, Bangla writing that's published in Bengal finds its way very easily across the border to Bangladesh and vice versa.
But I think one important point when we're talking specifically about English writing and the importance of interaction and what you were talking about is co-publishing is because I think a writer gets confidence and much more opportunity if they can be published in their own country. But it has been very difficult for those writing in English in Bangladesh because we have such a small English readership. And it is growing, and there's a lot of talent and a lot of exciting things being done. But, and we've just recently have had 3 English imprints starting to do publishing. But we would benefit greatly if these were then co-published or available, these books, because our readership is still quite nascent for English. And in that sense, this interaction would really help, and it is not there yet. Even when something is published, it is extremely difficult to get another publisher to even look at it or publish it, or even just physically take it to Pakistan or India. And it's only through very personal connections of often books are reviewed or this co-publishing takes place. And so that should happen a lot more, which I don't feel it does.
One of the things, because fiction, of course, has a much bigger sort of publicity and a lot more is published in the West and so on. I wondered, because in Pakistan, poetry was very strong. I mean, I had said earlier that had really was the genre that came into its own in the late 1960s and 1970s. How much knowledge or interaction is there between the poetry of these countries, between Pakistani English poetry, Bangla English? I mean, are you aware of it? Is there a sort of...
जैसे फैज़ साहब को there's, off the top of my head, there are 3 translations, and if somebody in the south of India,
No, I don't mean translations, I mean original work. I'm talking of people like Tawfiq Rafat and so on.
फैज़ अहमद फैज़ को उर्दू में हिंदुस्तान में पढ़ते हैं.
Yes.
अगर अंग्रेज़ी में अगर पढ़ना है तो विक्टर कियनन ने तर्जुमा किया है, न्योमी लजार्ड ने किया है, और आगा शाहिद अली ने किया है. ऑफ द टॉप माई हेड बेशुमार और हैं, बट there's also a language divide. I mean, somebody in Assam may not be reading Faiz in Urdu, and that's fine, but Faiz still has this Inqalabi resonance in the subcontinent.
No, well, we were, that's why I was saying, because in Urdu and the other languages, and even in translation, there is an interaction. In English, it seems to be kind of everything, or maybe because it's got such a small readership in all these countries, I don't know.
Who is a famous contemporary Pakistani English poet?
Well, I mean, in Pakistan, in England, there are quite a few. There are people like Imtiaz Dharkar, of course, who's both Indian and Pakistani.
Yeah, well, she's both. She's
both.
Indian
Yeah,
and,
sort of.
yeah.
But maybe we should ask you, Sadaf, because you're a poet, and is there an interaction between the poetry?
Well, as I was sort of mentioning earlier, I think that there's been a great interest from those very few people who are writing in English poetry in Bangladesh, an awareness and a great love of a lot of the writing that has been taking place since the 50s in India. And for example, from Ezekiel to Arvind Krishna Malhotra. And the way that they have used Indian English, I think, has also inspired Bangladeshi poets as well, but also to make English as our own. One thing that hasn't transferred so much is the way of teaching English, I think, in Bangladesh, which I think is still very much kind of Western oriented, and where you can actually use a sort of Indian intonation or the stress on the syllable. And I think once in Bangladesh we take that on, because we've lost a lot of English in the last 40 years, and yet a lot of young people are rediscovering English now that English medium schools are opening up and English is taught at universities. But there is still the stress on a lot of the Western poets. Even though there is now a knowledge of what is going on in India and Pakistan, but there should, I think, the way it's taught, if we are given much more freedom to use intonation the way we want, I think that's going to be positive for those writing in Bangladesh. But I still feel that there needs to be much more interaction and between poets of different countries to see what kind of experimentation is going on, or the kind of poetry that's being written.
But I think, generally speaking, there isn't an awareness, especially in poetry. I mean, Faiz, yes, certainly, Faiz is well known and he's translated. But even of poets from Urdu, writing in Urdu in translation, after Faiz, no. No. Very, very little awareness. Very little awareness in India of what is happening in contemporary Pakistani poetry. Very little.
Saab is sitting in the audience.
Yes, but I'm saying, generally speaking, in India, very little awareness of what is happening in Pakistani poetry, very little awareness of what is happening in India about Bangladeshi poetry. I'm speaking of contemporary times now.
I mean, perhaps it was, I'm not sure, but perhaps this path of kind of self-defining English and from after partition to the current day, India has been kind of in its own path, and a lot of the anthologies that are on English poetry have come out of India have very, very much been a sort of self-absorption. I mean, of course there's a wide range of Indian English poets.
No, but you're right. There's very little
Bangladesh,
curiosity.
Sri Lanka, Pakistan have been very much not part of this canon.
Very little curiosity. I mean, it's a very bad Indian habit not to be curious about our neighbors. It's
Well,
a very bad Indian habit, and
Well-
we are being forced to reckon with our neighbors because, suddenly they've become very visible. And so, yes, Pakistani writers are very popular in India now. What about the last 70 years, 60 years? Really, there was very little interest. If I wanted, when I published that anthology of Muneezas, everyone said, "Kaun padhega?" I said, "Dekhte hain kaun padhta hai?" I mean, we've always been told that, "Kaun padhega?" So, the point is this, that of course, when everything becomes popular, it seems as though it's always been popular. The point is, what do we do before it reaches that stage? Can we anticipate among ourselves what we are writing in our countries? We don't anticipate. We follow. We follow when a UK agent or a UK publisher or a US publisher or a whatever other language publisher discovers that talent, we then discover it here. We don't anticipate, is what I'm saying. Why can't we do that? Because we have very little interaction among ourselves. And I do say this again and again. It is a very fragile, very tenuous engagement.
I think it's time to open out to the questions. Any questions? Any questions from the audience?
They aren't interacting.
No, it doesn't look like it.
There's no interaction between audience and...
There are no questions? Well, there's one question, okay.
Excuse me. I am Benjamin. Actually, I am certain that H.M. Naqvi told the story about the Malayali community because he's certain that no Malayali be here in this stage. I am revealing that I am a Malayali. I know. It's okay.
There are two Malayalis at least.
Sedu is one of our prominent writer, and what I'm trying to tell you that this is because of how we can overcome the border politics of in literature. By the translation only we can, I think we can cross this border. Yesterday I met one of the Urdu publisher. What was his name? Jamal? Publisher name, Urdu publisher. Sorry?
Sange Meel.
Okay, he told me that he translated one of our prominent writer, Baikem Muhammad Bashir, into Urdu, and this is what we can do for certain times. What is your opinion on translation? Because but you or Muhammad Hanif or Musharraf Ali Faruqi are familiar in Malayalam because of you people are writing in English. But Urdu writers are not popular in language.
You're asking about Urdu writers?
Yeah. But what I'm trying to ask you is why we are choosing the possibilities of translation among us in languages. I need your opinion. That this is what I am asking.
Ajmal Kamal is sitting here. He does fabulous.
No, just hold it closer to you, I think. Try.
Very. I can't be any closer.
Well, yeah.
There, there is sort of fantastic work that Ajmal Kamal does in translation. There is historically been a lot of translation that the Urdu publishing houses have done. I'm not sure. I mean, I think O.V. Vajayan should be translated into Urdu, and we've got Ajmal Kamal, so I think he should look into it. Translation has its own. I bet a publisher would be able to talk more cogently about it. But translation has its own dynamics. I mean, O.V. Vajayan stories have this surrealistic, they're in the surrealistic mode. And that may or may not have resonance here. His stories are set in a particular time, in a particular place, with a certain agenda, and so a good translation would have to transcend the topicality of writing. I think this panel posits this question whether English language literatures of South Asia have been interacting with each other, and I feel that they have historically. Indian writers inform my sensibilities, perhaps I inform Indian writers' sensibilities, but I think on the local, on the regional level, there's been less interaction. There are very few people who know of O.V. Vijayan or Sethu Saab, and I think that would be it could be a more interesting question to pose.
Any more questions? Yes, please.
Yeah, hi, this is for Ritu. Listening to you, we realize how, what the challenges are in terms of conventional sort of cross-border interaction. Do you see any hope in sort of e-publishing or technology, or is there any hope there?
As long as the trade restrictions exist, the only possibilities I see are co-publishing. And yes, peripherally, or maybe in the future most significantly, the internet. But you see, I'm speaking about book publishing. And I think that, as I mentioned earlier, books are part of an entire reading culture, which has several ancillaries. There have to be libraries, there has to be an environment in which books are received. Of course, the internet is a possibility, but it's a solitary reception. Do you see what I mean? So in real terms, the only possibility at the moment is for co-publishing to happen. Now, it's not easy at all, as Sadaf has mentioned. And I'll give you one example. We used to co-publish quite a lot with Oxford University Press in Pakistan, but Oxford University Press in Pakistan now does very little fiction. So that that reduces that possibility enormously. We don't co-publish with Bangladesh at all, because till very recently, as Sadaf mentioned, there are now 3 new publishing houses that publish in English. But they are so new that they must find their feet first before they take a risk with something we do. So, and in Sri Lanka, it's absolutely zero. There is no local publishing. Very, very little local publishing in Sri Lanka. So, and Nepal, of course, forget it. Bhutan, there's not even a bookshop. So, no, these are facts. These are situations that you deal with. So, I can't actually see anything terribly positive happening except the co-publishing route, which I think will strengthen publishing across the region, by the way. I'm not saying it only as a matter of making books available, but it will strengthen the publishing in the region, which I think is very important. I do think it's important to do that. It will also encourage translations, because the multinationals are not interested in translations. So if we think that HarperCollins, Bloomsbury, Hachette, Penguin are going to be publishing our languages in translation, they are not. Translation is a long gestation, very slow return process. And their economics simply do not allow for it, except gine chune writers. Faiz kar lenge, or pata nahi chuktai kar lenge, or shayad Kurtalan Haidar kar lenge, and that's it. When Penguin published O.V. Vijayan, that H.M. Naqvi is talking about, they did it in the teeth of opposition, from within the company. From within Penguin, there was enormous opposition to publishing Vijayan, even in India. You can imagine, he is one of the most highly regarded Malayalam writers. Penguin began in India as a translation publisher. They were only going to publish in translation. They abandoned that within the first 3 years. They abandoned the translation project totally. They have now begun it because of all the spade work that was done by the Indian publishers, not because they invested the time and money. So we will only have translations across the region when local publishing is encouraged.
I just want to add something here. It's that I think what both HM and Ritu is saying is that the interaction between all of us it would definitely increase a lot more if we also have a lot of English translations, which is much more difficult to sustain and to encourage and get funding for that. But if there's some way that that can be made sexy again, then the written originally in English work will also have a greater circulation and market as well. From smaller countries like Bhutan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, because it's more important for us in a way to get that accessibility to India and Pakistan.
Any more questions?
I'm actually a literature student and I'm doing my bachelor's, and our curriculum, it includes literary works of, the poets like Edgar Allan Poe or the authors like O. Henry. But we're not doing stories of our own culture. We're not doing Pakistani literature or Bangladeshi literature or Indian literature. And I want to know how, since you're such renowned personalities, how can you introduce this thing into an education syllabus as well? Because we don't have this, we don't read any of this.
I think I've got it right. She's saying that in the colleges they're learning Western literature, and the Bangladeshi, Indian, Pakistani writers are not being introduced into the curriculum. So how can you expand that when it's not being taught in the school? That's what you're saying, no? How do you actually reach out to a market when it's actually not in the most basic thing, which is the educational institutions?
When I've taught, and I've taught at Boston University, and I've taught here in Karachi at Jamshed Hall. I have taught a mix of Desi and Gora writers, for lack of a better word. So, I mean, it's possible. Why don't you simply ask your teacher to introduce Malk Raj Anand, the first, considered the first writer writing in English from the subcontinent. Ask them to teach Ahmad Ali or Tia Hussain and Zulfikar Ghosh and R.K. Narayan and so forth. I mean, I think you should take the initiative.
Well, Hussein's answer to that is to take the initiative. Do you have any, and I don't know what the situation, in India I think it's taught, isn't it?
Well,
and I don't know about Bangladesh.
It's now being taught at the undergraduate level in colleges, but in a very limited way. There's one paper called Modern Indian Writing. I mean, of the other papers, it's almost always Modern American, Modern British, because these are English literature courses. And one option is Modern Indian Writing. So there is a sort of feeble attempt now to redress the situation, but in my view, it's still very, very limited.
Do you have a?
I mean, I think it's been introduced, but until it's kind of highlighted in the way it should be, I still think that we're kind of in that colonial straitjacket still.
Well, I do know that at universities and all, there's quite a lot happening. I mean, I know that in Karachi and in Islamabad and Lahore and all that, in the university they have started introducing South Asian English writing and Pakistani English writing. But I know that among the old school there was a great resistance to it. They thought that the literature, English literature, was the literature of England or the literature of America, and this kind of attitude was perpetuated. So I think actually I quite agree with Hussein's view that perhaps if you have books of interest, maybe you should sort of mention it to your teachers. Well, why can't we do this? I don't know. I don't know the authoritarian system, how that would, but it would be a good idea.
You got a question there?
We have a question?
I wanted to say,
Oh, Naz, okay.
I wanted to say that I read the book that Hussein is talking about as a kid in 1946. It was a book called Our India, and in it there was a map of India, and in it all of Europe and other parts of it were included. And I was most impressed that India was so big and that Europe was so tiny. I mean, I was about 7 or something, but it just shows that if you read the right sort of books at the right time, it does influence you. I mean, we read Twilight in India, Twilight in Delhi, also by Ahmed Ali, and so on. So one was looking for books as a young person, but we don't really have exposure to them. That's the trouble. It's very difficult. And I mean, when he's mentioning Mulk Raj Anand, it's true. People don't hear. The young woman sitting next to me said, who? So there we are.
Anything else?
There's this fantastic little essay, I think written by Mulk Rajanand about meeting T.S. Eliot in one of these Bloomsbury sessions. And T.S. Eliot was very suspicious of, T.S. Eliot asked, who are you reading to Mulk Rajanand? He was very young. And he said, I'm reading Iqbal, the great. And T.S. Eliot said, oh, yes, the great poet of the East. I think you should go further east and read some Buddhist philosophy. And so Eliot was dismissive of Iqbal. And Mulk Rajanand defended Iqbal steadfastly. And so one can make a claim that at that time, there was sort of, Eliot knew who Iqbal was, and Mulk Rajanand was defending Iqbal to Eliot. So there was interaction, that was some sort of interaction at that juncture of history.
Well, how are we for time? Time up. They've got us noticing time. Well, thank you very much, all of you. It's been actually very interesting for me because we've had diverse points of view. And Hussein believes there's interaction, and Ritu and Sadaf believe that there should be more interaction. I think that's how we sum up. Thank you all very much, and thank you to the audience. And thank you for your questions.
Thank you.